you looked at the types of regulations, maybe one county was being more restrictive than another one. One town was actually putting in place restrictions just solely for the purpose of keeping that operation out and to go somewhere else. And so the legislature in 2004 passed legislation called Livestock Facility Siting, also called the Siting Law, that kind of put some new rules in place around this whole game of what can and cannot take place with local regulation. So there's really two things to mention around this. The first thing is that when it comes to zoning and zoning ordinances in particular, and remind me, do you have countywide zoning?
We have zoning in approximately 2/3 of the county.
2/3 of the county, okay. Okay. So when it comes to zoning ordinances in particular, the siting law kind of, again, lays out the rule of how you can, if you decide to exclude or if you decide to place restrictions on the size of livestock operations, it signals what you can and cannot do. So when you've got a zoning ordinance in place, and the Eau Claire County zoning ordinance, that first agricultural district that you have in your zoning ordinance, so that's your A1 district, your exclusive ag district. Siting law says that you cannot place any restrictions on the size of operations that actually become, that would be located inside of your primary agricultural district. So usually your A1 district. You cannot put a cap on the size of an operation. That applies to new operations that would be located in your county, and that would apply to expansions too.
Chris, clarification, in Eau Claire County a couple of years ago, the A1 district renamed A preservation.
Okay. Exclusive ag district?
It was
yeah.
Exclusive ag.
Oh, okay. Gotcha. Apparently I don't have your latest, greatest zoning ordinance in my hand. Okay. All right. Thank you for correcting me on that. Now, what it also says that if you want to restrict the size or cap the size of livestock operations in other agricultural districts, so if a county has in their zoning ordinance an A2, an A3, you can start to place restrictions, but there's a caveat on that. And that being that if you do place a restriction, let's say in your A2, and say we're not going to have any livestock operations located in an A2 greater than 500 animal units, then you need to have inside your zoning ordinance adopted findings of fact that give the justification for doing so, and they need to be based on public health and safety reasons. So that caveat needs to be met in order to be meeting the siting law. If you're meeting that criteria, then you are allowed to cap the size of livestock operations, and you could even exclude livestock operations in districts too. So long as you have your primary district, no cap, no restrictions, you can do so in the other ones using justification of public health and safety. Yeah.
So what kind of public health and safety would it be? Say the groundwater is polluted, or the watershed the river is polluted, or what would the county use as rationale to protect the health?
Please repeat the question.
Yeah, for the folks online, the question was to meet what kind of actions would be considered public health and safety, or what kind of protections would be considered under public health and safety. It depends is the answer in a sense. I mean, there's not a lot of guidance through court cases, for instance, on public health and safety. But in general, public health and safety usually is covered by public health and safety around roads, traffic, safety and concerns around there. It could be water quality concerns also, could be included in that. Generally, what's not considered to be public health and safety is property values, and effects on property values would not be covered under public health and safety. But most certainly, groundwater contamination could be included in that. in areas where you're talking about, I mean, residences that rely on that as their public water source.
On the issue like we're teaching them there, if the groundwater is proven to be contaminated, that's one thing, but this, I mean, anybody could have a concern on anything as far as, they call it, public safety. And, who is going to determine whether they have a legitimate concern?
So who determines whether or not it actually meets that,
Yeah.
that public health and safety? Typically when things are challenged and people call into question exactly what you're talking about. So someone adopts in an ordinance, justifies it for, we're doing this for public health and safety. We're doing this to protect. Someone could challenge it. The courts, through a court case, perhaps we have some guidance after the fact that help us as we're looking at it anew, or a county when they're looking to go at this, have some guidance as to whether or not what you're doing is legal or not. And like I said, I mean, so there are a lot of ordinances in place right now that would affect livestock operations out there. Many ordinances, I would say, that are in place and adopted by towns. And I think it's pretty safe to say that if challenged on several different ordinances throughout the state, some of the more local ordinances, the town ordinances, I think there would be some. I think many of those ordinances would fall in a court challenge. Now, so that leaves some gray area for a county considering this, just as far as from a practical standpoint, from what I'm laying out here is that on a county basis, to put in place a zoning ordinance where you've got multiple ag districts and you start to restrict size or put caps on the size of livestock facilities is a very challenging thing to do under a county zoning ordinance, because county zoning, it covers a huge area. Towns, maybe it's a little bit more manageable, just talking about size and geography. Really, the only example we have of anybody doing this effectively and doing it in a methodical fashion is the town of Lamartine in Fond du Lac County, which took a proposed town ordinance through a public process, just as always, and set up a situation where they've got 4 different agricultural districts. They've got their A1, no size restriction. And that district, Lamartine, is just to the west of the city of Fond du Lac. The eastern side of the town, sorry, I'm backwards here. So for you guys, the eastern side of the town of Lamartine, close to Fond du Lac, as you can imagine, there's a lot more traffic, roads, use of roads, busyness around a lot of livestock operations, as well as residences that are inside and outside the city. And so what they did is they set up their ag A1 district furthest away from the city of Fond du Lac. There's no size restrictions. And then the 3 ag districts, as you get closer to the city, all have caps on the number of animal units. And it's a reduction in size as you get closer to Fond du Lac. Obviously, not every town is set up to be able to do something like that or even consider something like that. Could they be challenged in a situation in a court of law? I don't know. By general appearances, they meet the criteria of the siting law. And they're using public health and safety, but traffic safety as the main reason for doing this. Yeah.
Clarification on the decision process. Who's the county or the town decides to propose something, and then Department of Ag decides whether it complies with the law or not?
No, Department of Ag has nothing to say about any of this. We have no role in this. This is local. This is a local decision only.
We're going to do this. The legal challenges are to that decision.
Exactly. The local jurisdiction is on the hook, so to speak, or taking the risk on this, one way or the other. There's no certification from any state agency, including the Department of Agriculture, for writing anything within your zoning ordinance. I mean, certainly we can review it to give you an opinion as to whether or not we feel it complies with the siting law. Whether or not you take up the advice of the department is completely up to the local jurisdiction, though, entirely. So that's the first facet of the siting law. And it's not something that's, to be honest, used a whole lot in the way that I described, where you've got someone through zoning making different districts and considering size restrictions on farms and that sort of thing. So, but it's there. All right, so the second part of the siting law when it was put in place was to say that if you, the county or town or village or city for that matter, decide through either a zoning ordinance or through a licensing ordinance that you want to issue a permit to a livestock facility, you're free to do so. But there are rules behind how you go about doing this. And all those rules are contained inside of ATCP 51, which is the administrative code for livestock facility siting. It lays out what the process is. So there's a state application that the farmer actually has to have filled out in full, handed in to the county or town that's adopted this authority to issue a permit. It needs to be complete. All the information needs to be there. It needs to be reviewed. And then the county or town has so much time to actually call the application complete and has so much time to issue the permit or deny the permit to the operator. It is an absolute choice on the part of the local jurisdiction as to whether or not they want to adopt through ordinance the authority to issue permits to livestock operations. And if you take a look at the state of Wisconsin, and maybe you can get this up, there's a map on our website that shows who has adopted livestock siting authority. Click on that top link there. It's a choice to do so or not. And so around the state of Wisconsin right now, all the counties that you see in white have not adopted livestock siting authority. So they do not have anything on the books around siting. And then all the counties and towns that are listed in red or green have done so through, in the green, counties and towns have adopted a zoning ordinance. The red ones have adopted a licensing ordinance. If you're wondering what the difference is, obviously there's a lot of parts of the state that don't have zoning. There's a lot of parts of the state, counties, let's say for instance, Marathon County, they do have zoning, but it doesn't cover their entire county. So they adopted a licensing ordinance so that they would have the ability to issue permits countywide.
But some of those are up to 500, or up to 500 animals. Like Jackson County has licensing, but it isn't the cable size.
So for the state rules put in place, the permit threshold is 500 animal units. So if you adopt an ordinance today that enables your local jurisdiction to issue permits, you cannot issue permits for farms less than 500 animal units. It begins at 500 animal units and up.
Could you explain, Chris, how someone was grandfathered in with a lower animal unit?
Yeah. So as I mentioned before the siting law was put in place and before the rules came on board in 2006, there were a lot of local jurisdictions that had something on the books. They had a local siting program. And so they were grandfathered in, and for several of those jurisdictions, they had a lower permit threshold. So for instance, Jefferson County, which did have rules on the books, they were permitted at 150 animal units, and they still do today, but that was grandfathered. For anybody who's adopting this authority after the siting law was put in place, they're not allowed to start below 500 animal units. You can choose to start at 750 if you'd like, but you can't go any lower than 500. Yeah.
So does that mean any farm under that doesn't need to go through that permitting process?
Correct. Yep.
So another question. Comparing Eau Claire County and Marathon County, you said
Yeah.
that Marathon County has a rule that would apply countywide because they're not fully zoned. Would that mean that our rule in their county only applies to zoned areas?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. Yeah, and as much as we're decent with technology, the department, I don't have for those that are zoned. For instance, Dunn County is a good example. I think out of the 20 some towns that they have zoning in approximately just maybe half or a touch over half, but yet I've got the whole county showing up as having an ordinance, but it doesn't apply countywide. And I would say right now we need to take Eau Claire off this map. And we can get into some of that later. But anyway, yes, it's listed as having livestock siding, but it does not have livestock siding. But as you can tell, so a lot of the action for issuing the permits, and the permits are in green, the green dots are all on the eastern side of the state, Shawano County, Marathon County, and then some counties over here in the western part of the state too. For counties or anybody who adopts this authority, this is taking an operator through the permitting process, issuing permits, and then thinking about how you monitor compliance of permits after the fact for a local jurisdiction. It's a resource concern. Does the department that's actually going to be handling this, do they have the resources to do this effectively or not? And I can tell you that there's a lot of folks that have adopted this that do it better than others. Some use it as a tool around making sure that farms are up to speed on runoff management, making sure that they're meeting technical standard on manure storage and all the rest, and they do it through this program. Others are just fine in handling some of those concerns through other programs and other regulation that might be available to them for their use. So what you've got at the end of the day is a mixed bag here statewide. Some use it effectively, some choose not to use it at all, some have adopted it and don't, and implement it, I would say, with fewer resources than some other places do. Now, as far as the standards that are included in livestock siding, so when you issue a permit to a livestock facility under these rules, you're issuing a permit that deals with some overlap here with water quality permitting that happens through CAFOs or through the CAFO permitting system here in the state through DNR, which begins typically at 1,000 animal units or above. So there's some crossover here on water quality. So runoff management, so dealing with runoff from farms, from feed pads, feed bunkers, dealing with meeting construction and technical standards as they relate to the building of manure storage facilities is also dealt with through these rules. Nutrient management plans is mandated through these rules too, and meeting the state standard for that. And then what's different about siding that is not true for other regulation typically are two different things, which is setbacks. So there's setbacks that relate to the structures on the facility itself. So you'd be talking about your animal housing, your barns, feed pads, manure storage, and all of those, the setbacks are anywhere from 100 to 200, and then for manure storage pits, it's 350 feet from a property line or from the public road right of way. And those are all state standards. And then when it comes to, there's also an odor standard that's included as part of the livestock facility siding, and that's very unique. That's only in these regulations does the odor standard come into play. Science-based, based on a model, it applies to all the structures that exist on the facility. It does not apply to land spreading of manure. So it applies to animal housing, livestock structures, lots, animal lots, manure storage. It all goes into a model, and you need to be able to get a passing grade in order to have an application that can be stamped by the county or town approved at the end of the day. If the operator is not able to meet the odor standard, then typically what choices they have in order to hand in a viable application is a couple things. They can either apply odor control practices, or they can decide to put more space between these structures and their neighbors in order to get a passing grade.
farm has gone through a livestock setting procedure. They have met the order setbacks. What protection does that offer that farm?
Yeah, so a farmer who receives a permit today, it's all based on the nearest neighbor and having a passing score in comparison to from the distance from that nearest neighbor. So today, from the day that they actually applied for the permit. If there are people who move closer to the operation after the permit is issued, too bad. Even if they do expansions in the future, they don't. So let's say 2 years from now, they decide to double the size of the farm. They would have to go back to the county, get another permit. But in doing the permit and doing the odor standard, the nearest neighbor that from 2 years ago was their newest neighbor today, even if there's 5 more people that built houses closer to that facility. So buyer beware in that sense. So that protection's in place for the operator. And typically around zoning ordinances, one thing I will say is that reciprocal setbacks could help take care of that, where you've got a setback saying that you cannot build a residence within a certain number of feet of a livestock operation. So there's things that you can do through zoning ordinances that would keep a situation like that from occurring. Maybe. Yeah.
But it sounds like compliance with the odor is all separation distance issue. I've heard of some operations using odor reducing additives,
Uh-huh.
and that would probably be not because they were required to, but just to be neighborly, maybe those things.
There's several operators that will do that. There's some that use covers over the top of their manure storage facilities, their pits. Some were decided to do that for a number of reasons. Maybe it was partly to pass the odor standard. Maybe it was partly to be neighborly, to tamp down on potential conflict and problems over the long term. But they do have the ability, I mentioned the odor control practices, so additives, diet controls on the animal side of things, as well as a number of things that can be done around a pit. And a cover on a pit would be sort of the ultimate there. I mean, the one time when you would have odor coming from a pit with a cover on it would be when they're looking to agitate it and then empty it and take it out for spreading. But then the rest of the time you would have a cover on it.
Are the non-structural practices way to get shorter separation distances if you promise to do them?
No, so all these practices just give you a better score at the end of the day. So this is a modeled score, and there's a magic number that needs to be met through the model in order to hand in an application for the operator that could be approved by a county or town. They don't affect the setbacks to the property, still apply and are fixed in place, and being either, again, depending on the size of the farm, either 100 feet to 200 feet for structures on the facility or 350 feet to the manure storage. And those setbacks don't change depending on the odor. But for the operators, if they're looking at building new structures, if they've got the space, the easiest way to pass the odor score is to put more distance between them and neighbors in many respects. But that's a big if. There's some that are pinned in and then are having to look at odor control practices in order to meet the odor score. And we're getting to the point with a couple farms in certain parts of the state, just given the makeup, the size of the farms coupled with the number of residences nearby the farms, where we're starting to see some producers that are having a hard time getting to a point where they could actually expand to the numbers that they were proposing to and meet the odor score. So that's siting in a nutshell. Does anybody have any more questions around that?
One other question.
Yeah,
Have there been any counties, towns, municipalities that have adopted livestock siting and then have withdrawn it from the books?
Good question. I don't know anybody who's adopted it in full and then completely gone the other direction and walked away from it, but there have been folks who have adopted it and they had a permitting threshold that was fairly low because it was grandfathered. And then as they rewrote their ordinance or made some changes over time, they decided to up the permit threshold. I think La Crosse County had a lower permit threshold and then went up to the 500 permit threshold at some point. But there have certainly been people that have tweaked their ordinance. So the ordinance, to meet law, needs to be consistent with the rules in place, right? The standards. But there's certain things that the state administrative code doesn't talk at length around. So things like modifying permits over time, things about monitoring compliance. There's no detail about monitoring compliance in the state standards. So a lot of counties that use this as a tool have decided to beef up their ordinance to put in more authority around enforcement, around monitoring of compliance, around the whole question of what happens after you issue the permit. Is that what it's all about, just issuing the permit, or are you actually doing something with this after the fact and checking back with the producer to make sure that the promises they made on the application are the promises that they're following through with afterwards. The last thing I'll mention, so even though the state standards are in place and the siting law is pretty clear that local jurisdictions cannot exceed those standards, for instance, the 350-foot setback on manure storage pits, it does allow local jurisdictions to exceed those standards if, and this goes back to the other caveat that I was talking about. So if you adopted an ordinance, a more stringent standard, so if you adopt it in your ordinance, you include findings of fact, again, that justify that local, more stringent standard for public health and safety reasons. If you meet those criteria, then you are allowed to adopt more stringent standards. And what I was mentioning before, there are a lot of ordinances in place, and it's mostly towns, I would say, that have adopted ordinances that are clearly more stringent standards, larger setbacks, what have you, where there also clearly are no findings of fact included in their ordinance that would support those things. That leaves them open to risk of being challenged, if they're ever challenged. I don't know. I also question with some of those jurisdictions if they're even implementing those standards in the first place too. But from the county side of things, there's not a lot of counties that have gone out and taken big risks with more stringent standards. Yeah.
Maybe this comes to the top, but I know that they adopted several ordinances, and one of them requires bonding, significant bonding.
Yep.
So if there is a significant bill that the owner of the property has to clean it up.
Yep.
And I'm thinking of a couple of other things like they adopted in their ordinance on the Fish Creek watershed,
right,
a requirement for a 540-day holding period of any new mineral storage.
right.
So, and that went, that Fish Creek thing went to court, and as far as I know, no, they didn't lose it. They talked to Dan Dufford from the County Main Conservation, and I think it's chapter 7, inside fire chapter 7, and he said that it's still in there, but they lost on that with the DNR because they were more stringent than the DNR, and the judge told them they can look at the DNR and try to. Well, actually, I got the court case, and I read it, and they haven't lost. The DNR was asked to give an opinion that provided more substantial reason for denying that Baker County, they have not done, unless it was just. Okay.
Yeah, there's a couple things to go through here, and some of this is explained in that handout I gave. But I'll try to go through step by step here because there's a lot of overlapping regulations that are involved in these things. So I think I'm trying to go back to what your first question was though, but what's that? Yeah, bonding. Yeah, let me hit that first. So if any local jurisdiction that's issuing permits, a livestock siding permit to a facility. So ATCP 51, the administrative code does not allow bonding. So if you're requiring bonding as part of your ordinance and issuing a livestock siding permit, that's clearly not lawful. What's that?
With the operations of livestock operations.
No, not a livestock siding permit. Is it allowed through other means? I would speak to your corp counsel as to whether or not there's other ways to perhaps require bonding. But there was a case recently, local town required bonding, issued a livestock siding permit, and that was struck down. Their requirement over bonding. So there's that. The other thing you mentioned about, so let's go to manure storage facilities, and you're talking about Bayfield County adopting a mandatory 540 days. So they're having to have 540 days of holding capacity for manure, for liquid manure from any livestock facility up there. So livestock siding, the standards that I just talked about, does not have any mandate for the number of days of manure storage. You're not required to have manure storage as you issue a permit. So some operators will easily have half a year's worth of storage because many of the people who are under livestock siding are also CAFOs too, and being regulated by the Department of Natural Resources and getting permits through them. And when they go through that system, they're required to have 180 days of storage. So many of the facilities will have that. The smaller ones that fall between 500 and 1,000 animal units, I mean, some might be daily haul or darn near close to daily haul operations, but yet still fairly sizable, and so may not have a lot of manure storage, or at least may not have that any manure storage in place yet when they first expand, but are looking to build that later in. So
A lot of the fields are snow covered with manure on it. So there's a whole lot of farms that have been spreading out there.
And let me get on one more thing having to do with Bayfield County, and this touches on both the siding law as well as I'll refer to Chapter 92 of the state statutes, Section 15. So that comes into play over this Bayfield ordinance. So anytime you're adopting a local standard, a county, let's say Bayfield County, Eau Claire County, whatever county it happens to be, adopts a local standard. So if they're having to meet the siding law and be consistent with the siding law. So if there's anything around manure storage, and they want to adopt a more stringent standard, they need to meet the criteria of having findings of fact in place in their ordinance justified by public health and safety. That's one thing. The other requirement they'll have to meet, because that is going, saying that you have to have 540 days of storage is a more stringent water quality standard in the state. And so 92 Section 15 comes into play too. And in order for a county to adopt an ordinance, a more stringent water quality standard, they need to get permission either from Department of Natural Resources or through DATCAP, one or the other. And that's partly what that whole court case had to do. They were requesting permission from the Department of Natural Resources for that more stringent water quality standard through Chapter 92, Section 15. And the department did not grant that.
Well, we haven't was sent back to the department. I don't think there's been a decision.
Right. I'd be shocked if they ever approve that, to be honest with you. It's a big jump. 180 for CAFOs all the way to 540.
But they had, you understand it, the Bayfield County and the Ashland also, but the amount of rain they had
Mhm.
that has washed out highways and, I mean, the horrendous rain up there. So I understand why they're a little more concerned about significant rainfalls.
And the criteria in 9215 to adopt more stringent water quality standards, I mean, if I can't cite it for you offhand, but essentially what you're having to show is that the water quality standards for the state that are in place currently are not stringent enough in order to end up with good water quality. And so you're having to show, the standard being is that you need this, whatever your new standard is, in order to meet water quality standards locally. So anyhow, and that is addressed in that handout that I gave you too. So I'll leave it at that right now, unless there's any further questions, and I'll kick it over to Lisa. And I know there'll be more questions coming our way around this. So anything else from your standpoint?
No.
No? Okay.
Well, I just thought of one other thing here.
Yeah.
The question I asked earlier, in the previous session, we must make reference in the codes to a lot of technical standards.
Absolutely.
In
Yeah.
reference to technical standards, are they always date specific in the codes?
Yes, they are.
Because Greg mentioned
Yep.
they have some references to technical standards in local ordinances that we'll just roll with the latest one. The
Mhm.
state isn't that way. The state
It is not.
Okay. And the other question was recently that there was an issue that boiled up both DNR and CAFOs regarding the technical standards for grass waterways for treating leaching.
Yep.
And that's all I know. I don't know what the details were. Are you familiar with that? What happened there and what was the issue?
Yeah, enough so. But long story short, so EPA got involved in some respects in doing some monitoring for vegetative treatment areas. So, I mean, vegetative treatment area is a grass area that's used for treatment of runoff from lots, from feed pads, primarily, and there was a technical standard involved with that. So it needs to be sized properly depending on surrounding conditions, of course, depending upon the size of the lot and depending on size of the feed pad and those types of things. So you had it sized by an engineer and all the rest. So you're needing to meet those standards. And that's pretty typical of any CAFO permit. That's involved in any livestock siting permit. That was sort of the method that was used for runoff treatment here in the state of Wisconsin for many, many years. And then because of the testing that happened around there, what they found was that there was a greater water quality concern, that perhaps these things weren't treating as well as what we had assumed for a number of years. And so there's a push to put in place, because all the technical standards are run through the NRCS. And what's true of the Department of Ag, and I think also safe to say it's true of DNR, is that through these permitting programs, is that those technical standards are put into place through the Wisconsin NRCS, and then they're adopted into the administrative codes and used through these programs. And so they redid the standard for vegetative treatment area, and for basically any facilities over 500 animal units, it meant that what they were going to have to do is not use a VTA, but instead capture all that runoff and put it into storage instead.
There that the technical standard got revised.
Yep.
And DNR was interested in doing that, but their codes probably referred to the old standard.
Exactly.
And so they really were prevented from doing that until they changed their codes.
Yes, I guess they were. So I can't speak for DNR offhand, but let's take livestock siding. So our code right now refers to the old standard, doesn't refer to the new one. And so we went through a proposed rule change. I guess it's been a year and a half ago now. That's another long story. Anyway, we didn't make it there, but we were proposing a rule change. We were having to address this situation. So what's always happened before is that when you've got a new technical standard, you just put the new one in the rule, right? It seems pretty easy, but this new jump means something different for the operator than the old one did. Rather than tweaks to what is a vegetated treatment area, it meant automatic capture and placement into storage, which is a larger expense to the operator. So there was pushback on the proposed rule change, in part due to that. And so now we're in a situation where we typically use these technical standards. So moving forward, how do we deal with that? Because to be honest with you, the ag groups may not be fully on board with a full adoption of that technical standard as it now exists. And so do we start to make our own technical standards when it comes to these types of things? How do we deal with that as a department? And that's getting down in the weeds for you all. But typically speaking, when you're building a manure storage or doing any sort of engineered type work on a livestock facility, our rules and the standards that need to be met are the latest, greatest NRCS technical standards for the construction of manure storage, for waste transfer. There's any number of things that are involved here around this, but yeah, this is...
Along those lines too, Wisconsin was pretty unique at the time when DNR, especially probably on your CAFO size, we were, they were allowing, so if you're a CAFO facility and you have your main facility and going into storage and you may have some outlots and things like that. And we had, I don't know if you're familiar with our barnyard systems around here that Craig's been putting in for years and the counties have. And our barnyard systems had these, what they weren't called, they're buffer air strips is what they were, where the flowed off, we call them VTAs now. And EPA kept pushing and the DNR kept saying, no, we're okay with this. We know there's discharge, but they want zero discharge, zero discharge, zero discharge. And that means not even out to the buffers. So the idea was to look at buffers and they became the VTAs and try to get something large enough to handle what might come off and things. So then there were all sorts of issues with that. So it became more pressure of back to the zero discharge and how can VTAs work or not work. It got so big they don't fit the sites and things. So storage then became the reality with what was needed.
Yeah, there's more to be said about the technical standards and which ones the county has in place versus which ones might be. Well, I guess you have language that do you automatically adopt the latest, greatest nutrient management standard, for instance?
Yes.
When it comes into play. Okay, you do.
And manure storage.
And manure storage. Okay. All right. You've got that taken care of already.
That's a good segue because that kind of
Yeah.
comes over into. I don't have to add, do I?
You're talking to people in Texas or something. They're out there.
Hello.